Hi there, this is Nature in Code. We're now beginning chapter 4, and this chapter is all about mutation and the power of mistakes. So, in the previous chapter, we learned a couple of very interesting things about evolution by genetic drift. And one of the rather depressing consequences of drift we learned is the total elimination of genetic variation in the long run. But clearly, something else must be going on because the world is not completely void of genetic variation. So, what is going on? Well, that's something else that is going on is mutation. And so, mutation is simply the random change in a genetic sequence. And most of those mistakes happen when a genetic sequence replicates itself. This process is normally highly accurate. So when a cell in your body replicates, makes a new cell, your DNA is replicated, and it's replicated very accurately, but it's not quite 100% error free. And so occasionally an error will occur, a mistake will be made, and the new copy will not be exactly identical base for base to the original. That is mutation. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, the mutations that happen in your cell, in your average cell in your body, those are not really important. The ones that are important are the ones that happen in your germline. So in the sperm or in the egg, the ones that are going to be passed on to the future generation. Now, ultimately, the effect of mutation is to increase genetic variation. And I want to write a short JavaScript program to illustrate that. And in doing so, we'll be falling back on this concept that we learned in the previous chapter of JavaScript arrays. And arrays are these incredibly important data structures. So essentially, as we've seen before, an array is just a list, right? A list of values or elements. And in this case, I want to store a bunch of strings, actually single characters for the four bases. The four bases are adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, and they're usually abbreviated with the letters A, G, Z, and T. So I just want to have a sequence here of random choices of these four letters. So I could, for example, have something like A, T, C, and maybe again a C, and here T, and then a G, oops, and then a G, and so on. And I'm going to put these in quotes to make sure these are strings. And as I said, strings can either be in single quotes or in double quotes. It doesn't matter. So this here is an array, and this could be our example DNA string. Now, your DNA string does contain about 3 billion of these base pairs. Of these bases, and of course I'm not going to create 3 billion bases here, but the idea is the same. So now so this is a one-dimensional array, and I would like to have a population of those DNA strings. So I would have another one down here, and then another one down here, and I would store those arrays in another array. So this gives me a two-dimensional array, and we previously already used two-dimensional array to store data of simulations. Now, what I would like to do here, just because arrays and multi-dimensional arrays are so important, I will now jump up one dimension, and I would like us to use a three-dimensional array. And this sounds a little scary, but it really isn't. And so the way to think about this, the way I prefer to think about this is, when I think of an array, I tend to think of, one column or one row. Yeah, it doesn't really matter. Let's have a row here. And so my elements, sort of the cells in this row. This could, for example, the example before, these could be my bases here, H, E, C, and T, and this would be one DNA. And so now if I would like to have a population, have an array of such arrays, then the best way to think about this is just like a spreadsheet, right? Now you basically have many of these arrays here in 2 dimensions. It's not just in 1 dimension anymore, it's now in 2 dimensions. yeah, would look like this. And so now this would be a population of these DNA strands. So this is a DNA, this will be a DNA, this will be a DNA, and so on. And this whole thing now is simply the population. And now I could go one step further and I could say, well, this is great. This is a population in this generation. I would like to keep track of this population as it moves through time and as it changes during, in that process. So now I just have to think in 3 dimensions. And how do you go from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions? Well, this becomes a cube, right? Because this is now sort of, if you think in 3 dimensions, these cells become little cubes. And so this is the 3rd dimension. And here, this is now the 1st generation. So now I would like to have the 2nd generation. So I would just add that back here. So now the 3rd dimension is essentially an array of populations. Population at generation 1, population at generation 2, and so on. So you get the idea, right? So this here goes into 3 dimensions. So to me, that's the easiest way to think about arrays. Think about rows or columns in the case of a 1-dimensional array. Think about a spreadsheet in the case of a 2-dimensional array, and think about stacked spreadsheets, or a cube, if you will, in the case of 3-dimensional arrays. And once you learned how to think in this particular fashion, it really becomes very easy to work with these arrays. All right, so what I would like to do is I would like to set up a population of these DNA strands, and then at each generation here, going from here to here to here to here to here, I would like to replicate those DNA strands, and I will occasionally make mistakes. And then, we'd like to see, okay, what does this population look like in a couple of generations? So we start with a population that's completely uniform. We will generate one sequence here, any old sequence, like maybe HECTATTC or something like that. And we'll make sure that those are all the same in the beginning. Okay, we'll just make one major copy. And then, as we replicate this over time, we will occasionally make a mistake. And so the question is, what will this population here, it's just an example, of course, of, absolutely no genetic variation, right? There's one DNA strand, just one type, no other alleles, just this one type. What will this look like down the road here, with occasional mistakes happening when we replicate the population in each generation? So we will implement this in JavaScript in the next video. See you there.